There are stories you hear once and forget by supper. And then there are the ones that lodge in you like a splinter under the nail, small, but you feel it every time you reach for something. This is the second kind. It is about four girls who learned to sleep in their boots so they could run barefoot if they had to. It is about a man who had quit caring about most things, and who found out too late to be comfortable about it, that he hadn't quit caring about the right ones. And it is about the particular kind of fear that doesn't scream, the kind that gets quiet, the kind that teaches a child to smile at a stranger so the stranger won't notice her hands shaking. I'm going to tell it the way it was told to me, and the way I saw the rest of it with my own two eyes. I won't dress it up. I won't tell you everybody was a hero, because they weren't, and I was the worst of them for the longest while. But stay with me. Because somewhere in the middle of all that fear, four girls decided they were done being afraid, and that decision cost more than any of us were ready to pay. So pour yourself something, sit close. Let me tell you about the Hadley sisters. I heard the dog before I heard anything else. It was past midnight, the kind of dark that presses on your eyes, and I was crossing the low pasture on the back of a mare too old to be out that late when the Hadley's yellow hound started up. Not the lazy bark a dog gives a possum. This was the other one. The high, broken yelping that says something is wrong here. Something is wrong. Why isn't anybody listening? I want you to understand something about me before I go further, so you'll know what kind of man you're trusting with this. I am not a brave one. I keep a ledger, always have. Little leather book soft as an old glove now, and in it I write down everything: head of cattle, sacks of feed, the cost of a horseshoe, the day it rained. My wife used to laugh at me for it. Amos, she'd say, you'd write down your own funeral if somebody'd hand you the pencil. She's been gone 4 winters. I still write things down. It's the only way I've found to make the world hold still long enough to look at it. When I get scared, I count. Fence posts. Stars. Beats of my own fool heart. It steadies me, and I am not ashamed of it, though I have learned to be quiet about it around other men. So when that dog started screaming into the dark, my first thought, God help me, was to count the reasons I shouldn't go look. It wasn't my land. It wasn't my business. The Hadley place sat across the creek from mine, a sagging little homestead that old Tom Hadley had worked himself into an early grave over, leaving behind a sick wife who followed him within the year and 4 daughters with no more than a milk cow, a garden, and a stubbornness I had mistaken at the time for foolishness. I'd nodded to them in town. That was the sum of our acquaintance. The eldest, Della, had a way of looking through a man like she was already counting how he'd let her down. I didn't much care for it. Truth is, I didn't much care for anything by then. When you bury the person who made you a person, you spend a few years being something less, a hide stretched over old habits, going through the motions of a life. That was me. I fed my cattle and I mended my fences, and I drank a little too much by the stove at night, and I waited, without admitting it, to be done. But that dog... I sat on that old mare with my heart going like a hammer, and I counted 4 fence posts, and I told myself it was none of mine. Then I heard the girl scream. She couldn't have been more than 10. Pearl, the littlest. I didn't know her name yet, but I'd learn it. I'd learn all of it, more than I ever wanted to. The scream cut off short, the way a sound does when a hand goes over a mouth, and after that there was only the dog and a man's voice. Low, ugly, the kind of voice that has learned it can do whatever it likes and has never once been told otherwise. I would like to tell you I charged in like something out of a dime novel. What I did was nearly fall off my horse. My hands had gone slick. I got down too fast, caught my boot, went to one knee in the cold mud, and stayed there a second, breathing, because I am a coward and 46 years old, and I had not held a gun at another living man in over 20 years. I had a rifle in the scabbard. I remember thinking, very clearly, you have never killed anybody and you are too old to start, and you will only get yourself shot, and then who feeds the cattle? I remember thinking that. And then I remember a different thing, quieter, underneath. My wife's voice, or what I had left of it. Not words. Just the shape of the disappointment she'd have worn if she could have seen me kneeling in the dark doing my sums while a child screamed 40 yards off. I took the rifle, I went. The yard was lit by a single lantern set on the porch rail, throwing everything into that orange shudder that makes shadows look alive. There were 3 horses I didn't know tied at the rail, and there were the girls. 3 of them stood on the porch in their nightclothes, bare feet on cold board, and the way they stood told me half the story before anyone said a word. They stood between the men and the doorway behind them, where I would later learn the youngest had been pushed back inside and told to hide. They had put themselves in front, all 3, the way you'd shield a fire from wind with your own body, knowing it'll burn you. The eldest, Della, stood a half step ahead of her sisters. She had a kitchen knife in her hand, not raised, just held down at her side like she knew exactly how little it meant and was going to hold it anyway. There were 2 men in the yard and 1 on the steps. The one on the steps was talking. He was a big, soft-bellied man in a good coat, the sort who's grown comfortable, and his comfort was the worst thing about him. He wasn't angry. That's what I want you to understand. A frightened man or an angry man you can sometimes reason with. This man was enjoying himself. He had all the time in the world. "And I keep telling you, sweetheart," he was saying, "it doesn't have to be like this. Your daddy signed the paper. The notes come due. Now I'm a reasonable man." He spread his hands. The lantern caught a ring on 1 finger. "I'll forgive the whole thing, every cent. All I'm asking is a little neighborliness." I'd seen him in town. Calbert Roan. He held paper on half the valley, and the half he didn't hold paper on, he wanted to. He had a way of buying men's troubles and then owning the men. People were careful around him. Now I understood why nobody had ever quite said the rest of it out loud. Della said something I couldn't hear. Her voice was steady, steadier than mine would have been. Roan's smile didn't move, but something behind it did. He nodded to one of his men. The man stepped up onto the porch and took the second sister, Ruth, I'd learn, the quiet one, by the arm, and she made a sound, and the littlest one screamed again from inside the house, and the dog threw itself against its rope, and Della raised the knife at last. And I fired the rifle into the air. I will be honest with you about what happened next, because it is the least flattering and therefore the most true. I had meant to say something hard and cold, the kind of line a braver man would have ready. Let her go, something. But when every face in that yard snapped toward me, my throat closed up entirely, and I stood there in the dark at the edge of the lantern light, an old man with a smoking rifle and no words at all, shaking so bad I had to lock my knees. It was Roan who spoke first, peering out toward me. "Who's that, then?" I worked my jaw. Nothing came. I counted. 1, 2, 3, fence posts, stars, the number of his men. 2 on the porch now, 1 beside Roan, 3 horses, 3 men, 4 girls, 1 of me. "That's far enough," I finally managed, and my voice came out wrong, too high, and I hated it, and I kept going anyway. "Step off their porch." Roan studied me a long moment. Then he laughed, not unkind, which was somehow worse. "Caldwell, isn't it? The widower across the creek." He shook his head like I'd disappointed him personally. "This isn't your trouble, neighbor. Go on home before you make it your trouble." And here is the moment. I've turned it over 1,000 times since. He was right, it wasn't my trouble. I had a clear path back to my horse, back to my stove, back to my slow, comfortable nothing of a life. He'd have let me go. He wanted me to go. 1 old fool fewer to deal with. I looked at the girls. Della had turned to look at me too, and for the first time the hardness in her face had cracked, not into hope. She was past hope, but into a kind of terrible, exhausted attention. Like a person watching to see which way a coin will land that they've already bet everything on. Behind her, Ruth had the man's hand still on her arm. The third girl, May, the middle one, 14 and freckled, and trying so hard to look fierce that it broke something in me, had picked up a stick of stove wood and was holding it like a club. 4 girls. No mother, no father, no money, no law that would lift a finger because the law in that county also owed Calbert Roan. And they had still chosen to stand on that porch instead of run. I had spent 4 years deciding I was done, that the part of me that loved things and lost them had been used up, paid out, closed like an account. I had told myself this was wisdom. It was not wisdom. I know that now. It was just fear wearing a costume. Let go of the girl, I said. It came out steady that time. I don't know where it came from. I'd like to tell you it was courage. I think it was just that I had finally found something I was more afraid of than dying, and that was the picture of myself riding away. Roan sighed like a man whose evening has been ruined by a small inconvenience. You're going to want to think hard about your next minute, Caldwell, he said. The man beside him moved his coat back off his hip. I saw the gun. My whole body went cold, then strangely warm the way they say it does. I had the rifle up. I had it pointed at the man's chest and my finger was on the trigger and the rifle was shaking, and I knew that if it came to it, if he drew, I would be too slow. I had always been too slow, 20 years out of practice and never much practice to begin with. I was going to die in the Hadleys' muddy yard, and they were going to die after me. That's the truth of where it stood. I want you to feel how thin it was, because what happened next nobody planned and nobody could have. The dog got loose. Whether it chewed through or pulled the post, I never knew. But it came across that yard like a yellow thunderbolt and hit the man with the gun chest high, and he went down hollering, and the gun went off into the dirt, and everything came apart at once. Della moved. God, she moved. She drove that kitchen knife into the arm of the man holding Ruth, not deep, but enough that he let go cursing, and Ruth scrambled back, and May swung her stick of stove wood and caught Roan's man across the jaw with a sound I still hear sometimes, a wet crack, and the man on the ground was screaming about the dog, and Roan was shouting, and I just kept the rifle up and kept walking forward, and I heard myself saying over and over in a voice I didn't recognize, "Off my land, off their land, off, off." It wasn't my land. I kept saying it anyway. It ended fast, the way these things do, with none of the satisfaction you'd want. They weren't going to die for Roan's evening entertainment, his men. The one with the bleeding arm got to his horse. The one May had brained went after him, staggering. The one the dog had hold of, well, the dog had genuine opinions, and it took both me hollering and Pearl, who'd come flying out of the house barefoot, calling its name, to get it off him. He left dragging one leg. Roan was the last. He stood at the bottom of the steps and he looked at me for a long, long moment, and there was no fear in him at all, and that absence told me more than any threat could have. A frightened man runs and forgets. Roan was filing me away. I watched him do it. I watched him decide I was a problem to be solved at leisure, the way you decide a leaning fence post will need attention before winter. "You've made a poor trade tonight, Caldwell," he said, climbing onto his horse. "These girls owe me $1,100. That debt doesn't go away because you waved a gun in the dark." He gathered the reins. "It just got bigger, and now it's got your name written under theirs." He rode off into the dark, unhurried, and that was almost the worst of it. He didn't flee. He withdrew, like the tide, like something that knew it was coming back. I stood in that quiet, ringing yard with 4 girls I barely knew and a bleeding dog and a rifle gone cold in my hands, and the shaking I'd been holding off finally arrived all at once, head to foot, so bad I had to sit down right there on the steps. Pearl, the littlest, sat down next to me without being asked. She had her arms around the dog's neck, and she was crying without sound, just water running down a small, dirty face, and she looked up at me and said, in the matter-of-fact way of children who have already seen too much, "You came. Just that, you came. And I want to tell you, I have buried a wife. I have stood in cold churchyards. I did not know, until a 10-year-old girl said 2 words to me on a porch step, That a heart I'd declared closed for business could be cracked back open by something so small it weighed nothing at all. "I came," I said. "My voice didn't work right. I'm here." Della came and stood over us. She still had the knife. Her hand had finally started to shake too, now that there was no one left to be brave for, and she looked down at me with that exhausted, cracked-open attention, and she said the thing that would set the next 2 weeks running like a fuse already lit. "You shouldn't have," she said. "He'll come back, he always comes back, and now he'll come back for you too." She wasn't ungrateful. I understand that now. She was warning me. She'd spent her whole young life learning that help was a thing that arrived, made the danger worse, and left. She was bracing me for it. She was, in her hard, exhausted way, trying to take care of me. "Let him come," I said. I had no plan. I had no money. I had a rifle I could barely hold and a body 20 years too old for what I'd just signed up for. And $1,100 was more than I'd see in 2 good years. And the law was his. And the town was his. And I had just made an enemy of the most powerful man in the valley over 4 girls who weren't mine, and a debt I had no way on earth to pay. "Let him come," I said again, quieter. The dog whined. Pearl held it tighter. Della looked at me a long moment, and something moved behind her eyes that I couldn't read, not yet, and she sat down on the other side of me on the cold step without another word, and the 4 of us watched the dark where Roan had gone and waited for morning. I took out my ledger before I slept that night, back in my own cold house, hands still not steady. I sat at the table and I opened it to a clean page and I wrote the date. And then I sat there a long time with the pencil over the paper, the way you do when you mean to write down what a thing cost you and you realize you haven't got the figures yet. I didn't know the half of it. I didn't know about the second note Roan held, the one Tom Hadley had signed in secret, the one Della didn't know about either. I didn't know what May had seen the summer her parents died, or why Ruth had stopped talking for 3 months and then started again like nothing had happened. I didn't know that the thing I'd walked into wasn't a robbery or a debt at all, but the tail end of something older and uglier that had been circling that little homestead for 2 years like a wolf that has learned the schedule of the flock. I didn't know that within the week I'd be standing in front of a man with a badge who'd look me in the eye and lie, or that Della would do a thing so brave and so foolish it would nearly get all of us killed, or that the price of saving those girls would be measured in something I never thought I'd have to spend again. I knew only what I wrote on that page, the single line, before I finally set the pencil down. Tonight I stopped being done. Then I blew out the lamp. The retaliation didn't come the way I'd braced for. I'd lain awake 3 nights running, rifle by the door, counting the creak of every board, sure Roan would come back with more men and finish what he'd started. I'd worked it all out in my head, where I'd put the girls, how I'd cover the yard, the whole grim arithmetic of a fight I had no business expecting to win. But Roan didn't send men. He sent paper. On the 4th morning, a clerk rode out from town in a clean coat, alone, looking nervous as a cat in a room full of rockers, and he handed me a folded document with a wax seal on it and wouldn't meet my eye while he did it. Then he rode off so fast he near lost his hat. I stood in my own doorway and read it 3 times before the words would hold still. It was a lien, not on the Hadley place, on mine. I learned later how he'd done it. Roan held the note on the freight company I'd bought my winter feed from on credit 2 years back, a debt I'd thought long since cleared. He'd bought up the remnant of it, found a forgotten balance, attached penalty on penalty, and now, with a judge's signature he'd surely paid for. The law said I owed him near $400, or my land went to auction in 60 days. I sat down on my own step and laughed. There was nothing else to do. It was the cleanest thing I ever saw a man do to another. He hadn't burned my barn. He hadn't shot my cattle. He'd reached into the dusty back rooms of my own past, found a thread I'd forgotten and pulled, and just like that I wasn't a neighbor with a rifle anymore. I was a debtor. I was his. I was exactly what the Hadleys were. That was the moment I understood what kind of man we were up against. He didn't want to fight me. Fighting is for men who might lose. He wanted to absorb me, to make my trouble his property, the way he'd made the whole valley's trouble his property, one quiet signature at a time. I rowed across the creek to tell the girls. I didn't want to, but they had a right to know that the help they'd warned me about had, just as Della promised, made everything worse. Della took it standing in the garden with dirt on her hands. I watched her face while I told her, and it didn't crumble the way I'd feared. It did something harder to watch. It went calm. The terrible calm of a person who has stopped expecting good news and has built a whole life out of the leftover. I told you, she said, no triumph in it, just a fact laid down flat. I told you he'd come for you too. You did. She wiped her hands on her apron slow. Behind her the garden was coming in beans, a few late tomatoes, the patient work of 4 girls keeping themselves alive on a quarter-acre of stubborn ground. I'd never looked at it properly before. Now I saw it for what it was, a whole economy, a war effort. Every row of it stood between them and starving. How much does he say you owe? She asked. Near 400. And us, 11. She nodded, doing the same kind of sum I did, the kind that keeps the world from blurring. $1,500 between us. A short breath that wasn't quite a laugh. We could sell every living thing we own twice over and not see $1,500, Mr. Caldwell. Amos, I said, if we're to be ruined together, you might as well use my Christian name. That got the ghost of something across her face, not a smile, but near. It was Ruth who came out of the house then, the quiet one, 16, with her mother's dark hair, and a way of moving through a room like she was trying not to disturb the air. She had a tin cup of water for me, which she set down on the rail without a word and then stood a careful distance off, watching. I'd noticed already that Ruth watched everything, that she catalogued a person the way I catalogued cattle. I didn't yet know why. There's something you don't know, Ruth said. Della's head came around fast. Ruth. He has to know, Della. If he's in it now, he has to know all of it. The two of them held a look between them, a whole conversation in it, the kind sisters have without words, and I understood I was about to be let into something the older girls had been carrying alone. Know what? I said. Ruth came to the rail. She put both hands flat on it like she needed it to hold her up. Papa signed a second note, she said. 2 years ago, the summer before he died, I saw him do it. He didn't know I was at the window. Her voice stayed level, but her knuckles were white on the rail. It wasn't for money. Roan didn't lend him money that time, she swallowed. Papa signed away the land, all of it, to clear the first debt. Roan's had the deed for 2 years. The garden seemed to go very quiet, even the chickens. That's not possible, Della said, but her voice had cracked clean through because some part of her was already doing the arithmetic and seeing it balance. We'd have been put off. He'd have. He didn't put us off because it suited him better not to, Ruth said, and now the calm in her was the worst thing in that yard, worse than Roan's. Think about it, Della. A widower with the deed to a farm is just a landlord. But 4 girls living on land he already owns, who don't know he owns it, who think they're fighting to keep something that's already gone. She stopped, made herself finish. We're not behind on a debt. We never were. We've been living in his house for 2 years, paying him in fear, and he's been letting us, because the fear is worth more to him than the $1,100 ever was. I have done a fair amount of living, and I have rarely felt the floor of the world tilt the way it tilted then. Because she was right. It explained everything that had never made sense. Why a man who held the deed would bother with menacing visits in the night. Why he'd talk about debts and notes when he could simply have sent the law to clear them out. He wasn't trying to take the farm. He already had it. What he was taking, what he'd been taking in slow, patient sips for 2 years was them. Their nerve, their sleep, their childhood. He was a man who'd found a thing more satisfying than money, and the thing was watching four girls fight for ground that had been pulled out from under them before the fight even started. I thought of Pearl sleeping in her boots. I thought of May with her stick of stovewood. I thought of 2 years of that. 2 years. Something happened in my chest that I will not pretend was noble. It wasn't the warm crack of feeling that Pearl had opened in me on the porch step. This was colder and older, and I'd felt it exactly once before. The night the doctor came out of the bedroom and shook his head, and I understood my wife was leaving, and there was not one single thing I could do to stop it. It is the particular fury of a man held still by a force he cannot reach. It had nearly broken me once. Now it had somewhere to go. I was angry. I want to be honest about that, because the title of this whole sorry business calls me an angry rancher, and people hear that word and think of something clean and righteous, a man riding out with the sun behind him. It wasn't clean. It was the ugly, frightened, helpless anger of someone who has finally understood the size of what he's standing against and knows he is too small for it. That kind of anger doesn't make you brave. It just makes the fear unbearable enough that you'd rather do something stupid than keep sitting in it. "Does she know?" I said. I nodded toward the house, toward where the littlest one would be, Pearl May. "No," said Della, "and they're not going to." "Della, they're not going to." Her voice came down like a gate. "May thinks if we just get one good harvest ahead we'll square it. Pearl thinks Papa left us the farm clean and Roan's a thief trying to steal it. That's what they're fighting for. You take that away, you take the fight away, and the fight is the only thing keeping them." She stopped, pressed her lips white. "It's the only thing keeping them upright. So no, they don't know, you don't tell them." And there it was, the first of the heavy decisions, and it wasn't even mine. It was hers. A girl of 19 choosing to let her little sisters keep fighting a war that was already lost, because the lie was the last warm thing she had to give them, and the truth would freeze them where they stood. I have thought about that choice for years. Whether it was a kindness or a cruelty, I have never decided. I think it was both, the way the truest things usually are. I should tell you about the sheriff, because the sheriff is where I learned the full shape of what we were up against, and it is also where I nearly quit. His name was Pell. A big slow man with a walrus mustache and a habit of nodding agreeably while he did you wrong. I rode into town the next day against Della's advice, against my own better sense, because I am a man who believes, or used to believe, that if you lay a wrong out plain in front of the law has to act on it. That belief is a comfortable thing to hold, and I'd held it my whole life, and I'd never once had to test it, because I'd never once needed it. I laid it all out for Pell in his little office that smelled of cold coffee and gun oil. The night in the yard, Roan's men, the threats. I left out the second note because that was the girl's secret and not mine to spend, but I gave him plenty. Enough that any honest man would have at least stood up from his chair. Pell didn't stand up. He listened with his hands folded over his belly, and he nodded along the whole time, sympathetic as a deacon. And when I'd finished he sighed and said, "Now, Amos, that surely does sound like a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding. Mr. Roan's a businessman. He holds paper all over this county. Folks get behind, tempers run hot." He shrugged his big shoulders. "But you're talking about armed men threatening children in the dark. That's a serious charge to lay against a respectable man on nothing but your say-so and 4 girls who'd swear black was white to keep their farm." I sat there a moment, counting the cracks in his desk, the flies on the window. "You're not going to do anything," I said, "not a question." "I'm going to look into it," he said, which we both knew meant the same as nothing, and then he leaned forward and the agreeable nodding stopped just for a second and I saw the real man underneath. "I'll tell you what I'd do in your boots, I'd let it lie. You've got your own troubles with that Leon, I hear. Man your age, alone, no sons, no money, you don't want to go borrowing more." He sat back. The mask came down again, smooth as ever. "Roan looks after his friends, Amos. And he remembers folks who aren't." I understood then that there was no door I could knock on in that town that Roan hadn't already walked through ahead of me. The law was his. The bank was his. The judge who'd signed my lien was his. He didn't own one man. He owned the web, and the web was the town, and the four of us were a fly that had landed in the wrong corner of it. I rode home that day genuinely beaten. I'll confess it. I sat my horse at the top of the creek rise looking down at my little place and the Hadleys' little place across the water, and I thought, I cannot win this. There is no fight here to be won. A wiser man would take what's left of his 60 days, sell out, ride west, and start over somewhere the name Roan means nothing. I even started to turn the horse. What stopped me was the smoke. A thin gray thread of it, rising from the Hadleys' chimney into the late afternoon, and then, as I watched, a second thread and a third, too low, too spread out to be a chimney. My gut dropped. I put the heels to that old mare and went down the rise faster than was safe, the creek throwing up around her legs, and came pounding into the yard to find. Not a fire, or not the fire I'd feared. The girls were burning something. A bonfire, deliberate, in the bare patch by the woodpile, and they were feeding it. Della and Ruth and May, hauling things out of the house and the barn and putting them to the flame, and Pearl darting between them with her arms full, and for one wild second I thought they'd lost their minds. Then I saw what they were burning. Roan's ledgers. Not his, they couldn't get his, but every scrap of paper that tied them to him, the dunning letters, the receipts for the payments they'd scraped together over 2 years and handed over in the dark, the records of the debt, every document Roan had ever sent to the farm, 2 years of his paper trail going up in smoke. Della, what in God's name? She turned to me, and her face was lit orange by the fire, and it was wild in a way I hadn't seen, and alive in a way I hadn't seen. And I understood she had decided something while I was in town learning how thoroughly we were beaten. You went to the law, she said. It wasn't an accusation. I knew you would. I knew what he'd say. Then you know it's hopeless. He owns paper, she said fiercely. That's all he is, Amos. He's not a man, he's a stack of paper with a fat belly. The deed, the notes, the liens, paper, and paper burns. She fed another fistful to the flames. I can't fight his men. I can't fight the sheriff, but I have been thinking all day about what he actually has, and the answer is nothing he could prove without his documents. The second note Papa signed, Ruth saw him sign it, but where's the deed now? In Roan's strongbox in town. One copy, and the first note, and every record of what we supposedly owe. It's all on paper, and most of it's in one place. A cold feeling started up in me. Della, tell me you're not thinking what I'm going to take it back, she said. All of it. I'm going to walk into Calbert Roan's house, and I am going to take back the paper that says he owns us, and I am going to burn it the way I'm burning this, and then there will be no deed, no note, no debt, no proof of anything, and 4 girls and an old rancher will just be folks living on their own land, and let him try to prove different to a judge without one scrap of ink to do it with. It was insane. It was the most dangerous, foolhardy, desperate thing I'd ever heard come out of a person's mouth. And God forgive me, standing in that orange light, beaten and angry and out of every other option, I could not find the place in me that thought she was wrong. You'll be killed, I said. If he catches you in his house, the law won't even have to look the other way. You'll be a thief in a man's home in the dark. He'd be within his rights. Then I won't get caught. Della. He's having a supper, she cut in. Sunday, half the county worthies. I heard it from the Petrie girl who's serving it. The whole house lit up, full of people, everyone in the front rooms. Her eyes were bright and terrible. His strongbox is in the study at the back. And on a night like that, with the place full of fine folks and wine, who's watching the back study? Who's even thinking about it? I stood there in the smoke and the heat, and I did the most cowardly and the most loving thing I have ever done, in the same breath. I tried to talk her out of it, and when I saw I couldn't, I told her I'd go instead. No, she said before I'd half finished. You're known. You'd be missed, and you're slow, and you can't run, and if it goes wrong you'd be hanged, and the little ones would have no one. She said it gently, which was worse than if she'd said it cruel. It has to be me. I'm small. I'm quick. And I'm the only one of us nobody would think to look for because everybody in that town thinks I'm just a poor proud girl who'll be cleared off her farm by spring. She was right about all of it. That was the unbearable part. Every reason was sound. But there was one thing she hadn't accounted for, and I saw it on May's face, standing just behind her, listening. May, 14, who'd been quiet through all of this, holding the bonfire's edge with a rake. May, who I'd learned that night had a secret of her own. "You're not going alone," May said. Della turned. "May, you're not." The girl's jaw was set in that fierce, freckled way that had broken something in me the first night. "Because I know the house, the back of it, the study." A beat. Her voice dropped. "I've been inside it before." The yard went still. "What do you mean?" Della said slowly. "You've been inside it before." And May, 14 years old, looked at her older sister with an expression I have only ever seen on the faces of people much, much older, people who have been keeping a thing so long it's become part of the wall they lean on, and she said, "The summer Mama and Papa died when you sent me to town to sell the cow." She wasn't looking at any of us now, she was looking at the fire. "I didn't sell it to the butcher, Della. I sold it to Roan, direct, because he offered double and we needed it and," her breath caught, "and he had me bring it round to his house, and I was in there, in that study, while he counted out the money. And I saw the strong box, and I saw where the key hangs, and I have thought about it every single day for 2 years, and I never told you, because I was ashamed of how he looked at me, and because I knew you'd never let me near him again." She finally looked up. "So I'm going. I'm the only one who knows where the key is, and I'm done being ashamed of the one thing I know that might save us. I want to stop here, because this is where the night turned, and you should feel the weight of it before I tell you the rest." I was standing in a burning yard with 4 girls who weren't mine. The eldest had just laid out a plan to commit a crime that would either save them or hang her. The middle one had just confessed a secret she'd carried alone since she was 12, a secret about a grown man and the way he'd looked at her, and had volunteered that wound up as a weapon, because it was the only weapon she had. And I, the angry rancher of this story, the man who'd ridden in with a rifle and a heart he thought was closed. I had a choice to make, and it was the heaviest one yet, heavier than firing into the dark, heavier than refusing to ride away. Because the safe thing, the decent thing, the thing a good man does is to forbid it, is to say no. You are children. I will not let you become criminals. I will not let you walk into that house. I will take my chances with the law and the lien, and we will lose with our hands clean. That's what a good man says. I looked at Della, who had stopped expecting good news at 19. I looked at May, who had carried a man's wrong look inside her for 2 years and turned it, by sheer will, into a key. I looked at Ruth, who watched and catalogued and had just handed me the truth that armed us all. I looked at Pearl, asleep on her feet by the woodpile, boots on, ready to run. And I understood that to forbid them was to take from them the one thing Roan had not yet managed to take, the choice to fight back on their own terms. He had taken their land, their sleep, their father's good name, May's summer, Della's youth. He had taken almost everything. I would not be the one to take the last of it. "All right," I heard myself say, in that voice I still didn't recognize. "All right, but not like that. Not just the 2 of you in the dark hopping." I crouched down by the fire so I was level with them, an old man's knees popping, and I started to do the only thing I have ever truly been good at. I started to make a plan, a careful one. I took out my ledger and I opened it to a clean page, and in the orange light I began to write down everything. The supper, the Sunday, the back study, the key, who'd be where and when, every fence post of it, every star. "If we're going to do this insane thing," I said, "we are going to do it counted. We're going to know where every single person is going to be every single minute. Because I'll tell you the one thing I've learned in 46 years, girls." The pencil was steady now. My hands had stopped shaking somewhere in the last hour and I hadn't even noticed. A frightened man does things by feel, and gets caught. A counted man. I looked up at the four of them, lit by the fire, watching me the way you watch the last bridge before a flood. A counted man, I said, gets away. What I didn't write in the ledger, what I didn't tell them, was the cold thread of certainty running under all my careful sums. That Roan was not a careless man. That a careless man does not own a county. That somewhere in that lit-up house full of wine and worthies, behind the unwatched study door, there would be something waiting that none of my counting could account for. I didn't know what it would cost yet. I only knew, watching May feed the last of Roan's paper to the flames, that we were past the place where the cost could be refused. Sunday came the way bad days do, too bright, too ordinary, the sky not having the decency to look like anything was the matter. We'd spent 4 days on the plan. I'd filled 6 pages of the ledger and torn out 3 and started over. We knew the supper began at 7. We knew Roan kept the study at the back left of the house, off a hall that ran past the kitchen, and that on a party night the kitchen would be a hurricane and nobody in it would have a spare second to wonder about a hall. We knew the Petrie girl was serving and had agreed, terrified, brave, asking nothing in return, but to be left out of it after, to leave the kitchen's back door off the latch. We knew the strongbox sat in the study, and the key hung on a nail behind a framed map of the county, because May knew. Because May had stood in that room 2 years ago with her cow money in her fist and a man's eyes on her, and had memorized the room the way you memorize the inside of a thing you're afraid of. What we did not know, what I'd written at the bottom of the last page and underlined twice, and could not solve no matter how I counted, was the dog. Roan kept a dog, a big silent one. The Petrie girl had mentioned it like an afterthought, and it had cost me a night's sleep, because a man's dog in a man's house in the dark is the one thing no plan accounts for. I'd lain awake doing sums about a dog I'd never seen. I should have lost sleep over something else, but I'll get to that. The plan was this, and I'll lay it out plain so you feel every piece of it the way I did, riding toward town with 2 girls and an old hound in a borrowed wagon, my heart going like a hammer in my hands, for once, dead steady. Della and May would go in through the kitchen door while the supper ran loud in the front rooms. May would lead them to the study. Della would open the box, take everything, the deed, the notes, the records, all of it, and they'd be out in under 5 minutes, back across the dark yard to where I'd be waiting with the wagon in the lane behind Roan's property, the old hound beside me on the seat to make us look like nothing, just an old man and his dog parked in the dark, which in that county was a thing too sad to be worth a second glance. Ruth had wanted to come. We'd argued. In the end, I'd sent her with Pearl to the church social 2 miles off, in plain sight of 40 people, so that if it all went wrong there'd be 2 Hadley girls with 40 witnesses to say they'd been nowhere near Calbert Roan's house. Somebody had to survive this clean. Somebody had to be left to raise Pearl if the rest of us hanged. Ruth had understood that better than anyone. She'd nodded, gone white, and taken Pearl's hand. The last thing she said to me, low, so the little one wouldn't hear, "Bring them back, Amos. I've already watched one family leave through a door. I can't do it twice." I told her I would. I have spent a great deal of my remaining life thinking about that promise. 7 o'clock. The house lit up like a paper lantern, every window gold, the sound of a piano and voices, and the bright, meaningless laughter of people who have never once been afraid of losing their home. I sat the wagon in the dark lane with the hound's warm weight against my leg, and I watched 2 small shadows slip across the yard and through the kitchen door, and then there was nothing to do but count. I counted the windows, 11 lit. I counted the horses at the front rail, 9. A good crowd, good. The bigger the crowd, the smaller 2 girls in a back hall. I counted my own breaths and lost the number and started over. I have never in my life felt time move the way it moved in that lane. Each minute had weight, had texture, had a smell, wood smoke and horse, and the cold green smell of the creek somewhere off in the dark. The piano started a new tune. A woman laughed too loud. Somewhere a clock I couldn't see struck the quarter hour and I near came out of my skin. 3 minutes, 4. The hound lifted its head. I felt it before I understood it, that low change in the air a dog gives you, the warning under the warning. Its ears had come up and it was staring not at the house but down the lane the other way, toward the road into town, and a cold certainty went through me that I had counted the wrong thing entirely. Because Roan was not at his own supper. I learned it all afterward, the shape of how he'd outthought us, and I'll give it to you now so you understand the trap we'd walked into. The Petrie girl, brave as she was, had been watched. Roan watched everyone. That was the whole of him. He'd known for 2 days that something was coming, not the what, but the when. And so he had thrown his bright, loud supper and filled his house with worthies, and made himself the most visible man in the county on the very night he expected to be robbed. And then he had quietly left it. He was not in the gold-lit front rooms. He had slipped out the side near dark with 2 men, and gone to wait in the one place he knew a desperate girl would come. He was in the study. Sitting in the dark of his own study, with the strongbox on the desk in front of him like bait, waiting. I have never moved so fast in my life as I moved when that hound lifted its head, and it was not fast enough. It is never fast enough. I am always 20 years too slow. I have made my peace with almost everything, but I have never made my peace with that. I was off the wagon and across the yard before I decided to be. The kitchen was a hurricane just as we'd planned, full of steam and clatter, and the cooks barely glanced at an old man pushing through because the night was chaos and he might have been anyone's hired help. I went down the hall toward the back left of the house, toward the study, and I heard. May scream. Not the first night's scream, cut short by a hand. This was a full one, a scream with the whole of a person behind it, and it did to me what nothing in 20 years had done. It burned the fear clean out of me. There was no room left for it. There was only the hall and the door and the sound of my own girl, and she was mine by then. They all were. I had not asked for it and could not have stopped it screaming on the other side of it. I went through the door. This is the part I have told the fewest times, and I will tell it to you plainly, and then I will not linger on it, because some things you go past quick or you don't go past at all. Roan was on his feet behind the desk. One of his men had Della by the hair, the deed papers scattered where she dropped them. The other man had May against the wall by the throat, and May was clawing at him, and that was the scream. The strongbox sat open. We had been allowed to get exactly as far as Roan had wanted us to get, and not 1 inch further. "There he is," Roan said, and he was smiling, the comfortable smile, the worst thing in the world. The smile of a man who has won and has all the time he needs to enjoy the winning. The angry rancher, right on time. He spread his hands over the scene like a host welcoming guests. Now we're all here. Now it can be settled properly. 2 girls and an old man caught thieving in a respectable man's home in the dark. He shook his head, sorrowful, delighted. Why, the law would hardly even need to be lied to, for once. I stood in that doorway, unarmed. I'd left the rifle in the wagon that had been part of the careful counting. An unarmed old man parked in the dark draws no eyes, and I understood that I had brought 2 girls into a trap and counted us all to death. And Della, with a man's fist in her hair and her plan in ruins on the floor, looked across that room at me, and she did not look afraid. She looked sorry for me. What broke it open was the smallest of us, and she wasn't even supposed to be there. Pearl. I had sent her to the church social with Ruth, 2 miles off, in front of 40 witnesses, where she would be safe and clean and alive no matter what happened to the rest of us. That had been the one piece of the plan I'd been sure of, the one card I'd kept off the table. But Pearl was 10 years old and she slept in her boots, and she had spent 2 years learning that when her family slipped away in the dark, she was the one left behind, and she had decided, with the bottomless stubbornness of a child who has been left behind one time too many, that she was done being left behind. She'd slipped Ruth at the social. She'd followed the wagon the whole way into town on foot, in the dark, 2 miles. A barefoot, no, boot foot. Always the boots, little girl trailing her whole family toward the worst thing any of them had ever done, because she could not stand to be apart from them for it. And while Roan stood there smiling, and his 2 men held my girls, and I stood frozen in the doorway counting the ways we'd lose, Pearl came in the kitchen door behind me, small and silent and unaccounted for, and she did the thing that no plan of mine and no scheme of Roan's had left any room for. She let the dog in. Not Roan's dog, ours. Our old yellow hound, the one from the first night, the one who had genuine opinions about men who put their hands on the Hadley girls. Pearl had untied it from the wagon and walked it to the door, and the moment that door opened it knew, God knows how a dog knows, but it knew, and it came down that hall past me low and silent, and then not silent at all. It went for the man holding May. After that it was the first night again, only worse, only louder, a study full of fine furniture coming apart. The man let go of May to defend himself, and May dropped and rolled and came up with the fireplace poker, 14 years old and done being ashamed, and she did not hesitate. The man holding Della turned toward the noise, and Della drove her boot heel down on his foot and her elbow back into him and twisted free with a fistful of her own torn-out hair, and Roan reached into the desk drawer for the gun he kept there. And I crossed that room. I am not a fast man. I have told you that until you're sick of it. But a room is short, and a man reaching into a drawer is, for 1/2 second, a man with both hands busy, and I had spent 4 days counting every inch of that study, and I knew without thinking that the desk was 9 feet from the door, and I covered the 9 feet, and I got my hands on Calbert Roan before he got his hands on the gun. I am not going to tell you it was a fair fight or a clean one, or that I won it like something out of a book. I'm an old man and he was a big one, and we went down together into the furniture, and it was ugly and frightened and graceless. 2 creatures rolling on a fine carpet in the dark, while a dog screamed and girls shouted, and the gun came out of the drawer and skittered loose across the floor, and we both went for it. He got a hand on it. I got a hand on his hand. And here is the heaviest thing I have ever had to carry, and I will set it down for you now as plainly as I can, because you have come this far with me, and you deserve the truth of it and not a comfortable lie. The gun went off between us. In the long ringing silence after, I lay there with my arms around Calbert Roan like a man embracing him, and I felt the moment he went from a thing that was fighting me to a thing that wasn't, and I understood that the most powerful man in the valley was dead, and that I was the one who'd been holding the gun hand when it happened, and that I had not, in any way I could untangle then or now, decided to do it. It just happened, the way the worst things do, in a half-second in the dark with a child watching from the doorway. We did not burn the papers. I want you to know that, because the whole desperate plan had been to burn them, and in the end we didn't, and the reason matters. In the silence after the shot, with Roan's men fled out the windows and the dog standing guard and the 4 girls staring at me, and at the still thing on the floor, Della was the first to move. She went to the scattered deed papers. She gathered them up, and she stood there with the deed to the farm in one hand and a lamp burning on the desk in the other, every reason in the world to put the one to the other, and she stopped. If we burn it, she said slowly, working it out aloud, the way her father must have worked out his ruin 2 years before in this same dark room, there's no proof of anything. He always said that. No proof we owe him, no proof he owns the land. She looked at the papers. But there's also no proof we don't. No proof the land was ever Papa's clean and clear. We'd be 4 girls and an old man squatting on ground with a dead man, and a fired gun behind us, and nothing on paper to say a single thing was ever ours. She looked up. And there's a dead man on the floor, she said quietly. Burning paper doesn't change that. She was right. She was 19 and she was right, and I have never in my life been prouder of a person or sorrier for what being right was going to cost her. We didn't burn the papers. We did the harder thing, the thing that took the next 2 years and would not fit in this telling, the thing that is not dramatic and does not make a good story, and is the only reason any of us are alive and free to tell it. We told the truth. Not all of it all at once, but enough to the right people in the right order, because here is the thing about a web like Roan's. It is held together by one fat spider, and when the spider is gone, the web does not hold. The men who'd feared him stopped fearing him. The Petrie girl talked. Others talked. Others who'd signed his notes in the dark. Others whose daughters he'd looked at. 2 years of a county's quiet shame coming loose all at once now that the one man who could punish them for speaking was lying under a sheet in his own fine study. And the papers, the deed. The second note Tom Hadley signed away his land with those papers. That Della did not burn, told their own story. A story of a grieving widow's land taken for a debt that the gathering daylight showed had been paid 3 times over in the dark, in fear, in a girl's stolen cow money, in 2 years of a family paying a man not to do the thing he'd already done. It was not clean. I told you at the start it wouldn't be. There was an inquest. There were weeks I do not like to remember when I did not know if I would hang for what happened in that study, when I sat in a cell counting the bricks in the wall and a 10-year-old girl came every single visiting day and put her hand flat against the bars and said nothing, just sat with me, because she was done being left behind, and so she would not leave me either. In the end, the law could not make a murder of it. A man's own gun in his own hand, in a room he'd set a trap in, fired in a struggle he'd started, with 4 witnesses and a county full of people suddenly eager to say what kind of man Calvert Roan had been. It is the one time in this whole sorry business that the law did the right thing, and I think it did it less out of justice than out of relief. The farm went to the girls. Clean this time, on paper. Della saw to that. She'd learned the hard way in the hardest room exactly what paper was worth. I am an old man now, older than I had any right to expect to get. I am writing this at the same table where I once wrote tonight I stopped being done, and the ledger is a different one, the old one being long since full, but the habit is the same. I still count when I'm afraid. I'm not afraid much anymore. The girls aren't girls. Della runs the farm, runs it like a general. The same nerve that walked her into Roan's study turned now to weather and prices and the 1,000 small wars of keeping people fed. She married late. A quiet man who knows better than to tell her what she can't do. Ruth went away to learn to be a teacher and came back to be one. And the watching, cataloging way she has makes her terrifying and beloved in equal measure to every child in the valley. May took the longest. The summer she'd carried alone for 2 years was not the kind of thing that heals because the danger's gone, but she healed. Slowly, in her own time, in her own way, and the last I heard the freckled fierceness had gone into doctoring, of all things, into a hard, quiet competence at the edges of other people's worst nights. And Pearl is the one who comes to see me still. Pearl, who followed the wagon 2 miles in the dark because she would not be left behind, who let the dog in, who put her hand flat against the bars of my cell and would not leave. She is grown now, with children of her own, and she brings them out to the old man across the creek who is not their blood, and is somehow, in the way these things work, more theirs than blood would make him. She asked me once, not long ago, sitting on the same porch where it all began, rebuilt now, sturdy, the rail no longer sagging, whether I'd known that first night, when the dog started up, and I sat my horse in the dark counting reasons not to come. Known what? I said. That you'd stay, she said, that you wouldn't just chase them off and ride home, that you'd, she gestured at the farm, the years, all of it, that you'd become ours. I thought about it a long time, long enough that she laughed at me, the old man doing his sums. The truth is I have never told any of them the thing I'm going to end this on, the thing I have only ever written and never said, the thing that is the whole reason I picked up the pencil to set this down at all. I did not save those 4 girls. That's the story everyone tells, the angry rancher who took action, who rode in and put things right. But I was a hide stretched over old habits, a man waiting to be done, A coward who counted fence posts while a child screamed. I did not save them. They saved me. There are some things you don't say out loud. You let the other person figure them out, in their own time, the way Della figured out what paper was worth, and May figured out how to carry what she carried, and Pearl figured out that you don't leave the people you love alone in the dark. So I didn't answer her. I just reached over and put my old hand flat over her grown one on the porch rail, the way she'd put hers against the bars all those years ago. She understood. She always did. They all did. That was the thing about those 4 girls living in fear that I knew before I knew anything else about them.